Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we're checking out the new Intel Core i5-11600K. That's right, for this generation we are skipping a day one look at the Core i9 and even the Core i7 part, and instead we're going to be looking at the more affordable Core i5. Now there are a few reasons for this. Firstly, the 8-core i7 and i9 processors, they're basically the same thing, and they're a thing that many of you will have already seen as first reviews went up earlier this month. For those of you interested, I will still review the 11900K in a few days' time, but at $540 US for the MSRP, I reckon you'll be able to guess my thoughts on that one. The 11700K at $400 US, a little more palatable you could say, but I doubt I'll end up getting too excited about that offering either. So that does leave us with this guy here, the 11600K, as really, well, it's the only other unlocked Rocket Lake 11th gen model, at least announced at this point in time. Like the 10600K, the 11600K is a 6-core, 12-thread CPU packing a 12MB L3 cache and 125 watt TDP, along with the same $262 US MSRP. This new 11th gen model though does clock 100 MHz higher, boosting to 4.9 GHz, though due to the AVX512 support, the base clock has been reduced from 4.1 GHz to 3.9 GHz. It's also well worth noting that the 11th gen architecture is entirely different from that of the 10th gen series that came before it. Rocket Lake is somewhat of a hybrid architecture that's a result of two different backported technologies. It's a little bit complicated, but what Intel's decided to do here is take their 10nm Sunny Cove cores from the Ice Lake architecture and redesign them for 14nm. And given that makes it something entirely new, they've now called it Cypress Cove. But it's actually more than just that. Intel's taken the Xe graphics from 10nm Tiger Lake and backported that to this new hybrid 14nm design, though the name remains the same. It's a bit of a mess really, but that's the best way to describe Intel for the past few years now. Why they didn't just scrap this hybrid architecture and focus on Reading Alder Lake, it's a bit of a mystery. Presumably they're hoping that the marketing angle will help them sell more processors, not sure on that one. But whatever the case, Alder Lake, which is the code name for Intel's 12th gen core series, is slated for release later this year, and it is expected to use Intel's 10nm process on the new LGA 1700 socket, and perhaps even offer DDR5 memory support. So already this 11th gen series appears to be a repeat of what we saw with Intel's 7th gen core series. Anyway, not too distant future releases aside for now, let's take a look at the Core i5-11600K to see if it's a worthy replacement for the now very affordable 10600K, while simultaneously defeating the overpriced Ryzen 5 5600X. Now, for testing the Intel CPUs, I used the Gigabyte Z590 Aorus Master using BIOS version F5A. The board was configured with 32GB of DDR4 3200CL14 dual-rank dual-channel memory, and for the cooler, the Corsair iCUE H150i Elite Capelix White was used. Essentially, this is a 360mm AIO. All of this hardware was installed inside the Corsair 5000D airflow case and powered by the RM850X power supply. The Ryzen test system features the same cooler, though the black version, the same memory and power supply, with the key change being the Gigabyte X570 Aorus Master motherboard. Please note for this video we're going to look exclusively at results for Intel CPUs that aren't power limited, so no TDP limited testing. This is typically how we test Intel CPUs, as this is how the majority of Z490 and Z590 boards operate out of the box. So while we are using the default clock multiplier tables, none of the Intel CPUs are adhering to any power limits. Finally, all configurations were tested with a GeForce RTX 2080 Ti for the productivity benchmarks, but all the gaming benchmarks were conducted with the newer GeForce RTX 3090. Okay, let's get into the results. Starting with Cinebench R20, we see a very impressive 20% performance uplift for the 11600K over the previous generation model, and while that wasn't enough to beat AMD's 6-core offering, it did get Intel up to speed. The 5600X is now just 3% faster, which is a negligible margin. Basically, it appears as though AMD's simultaneous multi-threading technology is still a bit more powerful, because when we look at single-core performance, Intel is able to match AMD, as both the 11600K and 5600X produce a score of around 600 points. The gains in the 7-zip compression benchmark aren't quite as impressive, though you're still looking at a solid 14% performance uplift over the 10600K. Unfortunately for Intel though, that meant the new 11600K still trailed the 5600X by a 12% margin in this test. And we're also looking at a 14% uplift over the 10600K for decompression work. And again, Intel's SMT implementation isn't as efficient as AMD's, resulting in a 19% deficit to the 5600X. Intel's 10th Gen Core series was particularly weak for AES 256 encryption, but here we're looking at a massive 57% performance uplift for the 11600K, placing it 6% ahead of the 5600X. An incredible performance uplift, and this is the first benchmark we've actually seen where Intel now beats AMD. The 11600K made another nice step forward, this time in the Blender Open Data benchmark, where it matched the 5600X, offering a 15% performance boost over the 10600K. And we see that rendering performance in V-Ray has also greatly improved, as the 11600K offered 22% greater performance than the 10600K, again getting it within range of the 5600X. And then we're looking at a 14% performance uplift in the Corona benchmark, and this was enough to get within 5% of the 5600X. Here the AMD processor was 4% faster, which is actually a fairly insignificant margin. Next up we have Chromium code compilation performance, and again the 11600K delivers a 14% performance improvement over the 10600K, placing it hot on the heels of the 5600X. Again, the AMD processor was just 2.5% faster, which is a negligible margin. Even in the DaVinci Resolve Studio 16 benchmark, we're looking at a 10% improvement for the 11th Gen Core i5 over its predecessor, and that's basically the same level of performance we received from the Ryzen 5 5600X. The Premiere Pro gains are even larger. Here the 11600K beat the 10600K by a 16% margin, and again, that meant it was able to deliver 5600X-like performance. The performance uplift in Photoshop for the 11600K was huge, beating the 10600K by a 21% margin, and that improvement was enough to see the new 11th gen part just edge out the 5600X, though we really are only talking about comparable performance here. The margins seen when testing with After Effects are also very similar. Here the 11600K provided a 19% performance uplift over the 10th gen model, placing it roughly on par with the 5600X. Now this is where things go a bit wrong for Intel and their 10nm woes, which have seen them stuck on the tried and true 14nm process for 7 generations now, spanning 6 years. Although the Core i5-11600K was able to match the Ryzen 5 5600X in almost all of our productivity benchmarks, it pushed total system usage 41% higher in order to do so, as we can see here when measuring the average power usage across the entire Blender Open Data benchmark. Now moving on to the gaming benchmarks, and here we've swapped out the RTX 2080 Ti for the more powerful RTX 3090. Starting with Watch Dogs Legion, we're looking at a mild 6% performance uplift over the 10600K, which placed the 11600K on par with the 5600X. It was a frame ahead, which is obviously an insignificant margin, and close enough to call a tie. Interestingly, frame rates in F1 2020 go unchanged, as here the 11600K only matched the 10600K, and that meant the 5600X was 10% faster, or 13% faster if we compare the 1% low data. The new 11th Gen Core i5 CPU was still pushing over 240 FPS on average, so the margins here probably don't matter, but it was disappointing to see the 11600K trailing the 5600X, something we didn't see that much of in the productivity benchmarks. Next up we have Horizon Zero Dawn, and here we're looking at comparable performance with the Ryzen 5 5600X. The 1% low performance was identical, while the AMD CPU was just 3% faster on average. That said, the 11600K was just 3% faster than the 10600K, so all three CPUs delivered similar performance in this title. Intel was already just ahead of AMD in Borderlands 3, and the 11600K does manage to extend that margin, boosting performance over the 5600X by 4%. Not exactly earth-shattering stuff, but it was good to see Intel making some gains here. Frame rates between the 11600K and 5600X are identical in Death Stranding, and while that might not seem particularly impressive at first glance, once you realise that this meant the 11600K was 18% faster than the 10600K, well, that is a mighty impressive performance uplift for the new Intel processor. We're looking at a 7% performance boost for the 11600K over the 10600K in Hitman 2, or 10% if we compare the 1% low performance. That's a decent boost, but it wasn't enough to catch the 5600X, which still leads by an 8% margin. Sadly, here we are seeing performance go backwards in Star Wars Squadrons, as the 11600K dropped down to 249 FPS from 259 FPS with the 10600K, a 4% reduction. That's particularly disappointing as the 5600X already had quite a big lead over the 10600K in this title, and the result is that the AMD processor is 21% faster than the 11600K, which is a significant margin, though the extreme frame rates likely downplay the importance of that margin. Serious Sam 4 is another game where we're looking at little to no performance improvement for the 11600K over the 10600K, just a 3% improvement. That meant the 5600X was still 14% faster in this title, and again, that's a fairly significant performance difference. The Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six Siege results are a bit mixed. The 11600K did improve 1% low performance by 6%, but then we saw a 2% reduction for the average frame rate. The end result saw the 5600X deliver 14% greater performance, hitting 506 FPS on average. The village we use for testing in Shadow of the Tomb Raider is very CPU demanding, and here the 11600K does deliver a strong 11% performance uplift over the 10600K, which is great to see. That said, it's still not the fastest 6-core processor in this game, as the 5600X was a further 8% faster, hitting 159 FPS on average. Looking at the 10-game average, we see that Intel hasn't been able to reclaim the gaming crown, at least not for 6-core processors. Overall, we're only looking at a 5% improvement over the 10600K, and while that's a welcomed improvement, it still sees AMD out in front by a 7% margin. There's not much more to say here really, so let's move on to have a look at some power consumption figures when gaming. Given the power usage seen in Blender, where the 11600K pushed the total system usage 41% higher than that of the 5600X, I thought it might be interesting to look at the power usage when gaming with the RTX 3090. So here's a look at the Hitman 2 results, and as you can see, the 5600X was not only faster, but it also consumed less power, albeit only a little bit less, as the total system usage dropped by about 20 watts. Still, if we take a look at the performance per watt, you see that the 5600X is a 10% improvement under these test conditions. With a lesser GPU, that margin would increase, assuming you could produce a CPU-limited benchmark scenario. Here's another look at power consumption when gaming using Star Wars Squadrons. In this game, the 5600X was 21% faster than the 11600K, and overall system usage only increased by 4%, which is quite impressive given how many more frames the AMD processor was driving. It also works out to be a 16% increase in performance per watt for the 5600X over the 11600K, so the AMD CPU is certainly more efficient when gaming, though I do wonder how much gamers really care about this difference. Gamers are far more likely to care about operating temperatures, and I found when using the Corsair H150i that the 11600K and 5600X were comparable, operating at around 55 to 56 degrees when gaming and 60 degrees for core-heavy productivity workloads. A lot of you have been complaining to us about high 5800X operating temperatures, and that's not something I ran into with earlier BIOS revisions. However, a quick retest using the most up-to-date BIOS saw temperatures soar, hitting 82 degrees in Blender. Oddly though, the game temperatures were comparable to that of the 5600X. I have asked AMD to comment on these results, but so far I've heard nothing. I will continue to look into it though. Now, when it came time to overclock, I was only able to get my 11600K sample stable at 4.9 GHz. It was possible to boot into Windows at 5 GHz, but even with an uncomfortable amount of voltage, I couldn't stabilize the overclock. At 4.9 GHz, it was completely stable using 1.35 volts. And this 6.5% increase in all-core frequency boosted the Cinebench R20 multi-threaded result by a mere 3%. The 10600K on the other hand scaled far better with its 13% overclock that saw it go from an all-core frequency of 4.5 GHz to 5.1 GHz, and this boosted the score by 12%. And this is interesting to note for those of you who plan to overclock these processors. Whereas the 11600K was 20% faster than the 10600K out of the box, it's just 10% faster once both CPUs are overclocked to the max. The Rainbow Six Siege results are also quite interesting. The 11600K saw a 7% boost once overclocked, while the 10600K saw less than 1%. Now you might think that's not possible on a MIT, it certainly doesn't look right, but these results are based on a 3-run average, and I even triple checked that. There appears as though there's some kind of bottleneck with the 10600K that's not frequency related. That said, we did consistently see a notable uplift for the 1% low, which was improved by around 8% via the overclock. Lastly, here's a look at overclocking performance with Watch Dogs Legion. Like what we saw with Cinebench R20, there's little to be gained by overclocking the 11600K here, just an extra frame. We're also only looking at a 3% boost for the 10600K. So there you have it, the new Core i5-11600K. When compared to the 10600K, it's typically between 10 to 20% faster for productivity tasks, which is right in line with Intel's own claims of a 20% IPC increase. It also meant for the most part it was able to keep up, even match the Ryzen 5 5600X, so Intel has made up some good ground there on the productivity front. Though, as we saw in the Blender benchmark, they're nowhere near AMD in terms of efficiency, and that's of course down to the fact that they're stuck on the 14nm process node. When it comes to gaming, AMD's still on top. The Ryzen 5 5600X was 7% faster than the 11600K based on a 10-game sample. Intel also only made a small 5% step here from the 10600K, though we did see a significant 18% gain in Death Stranding. We also saw a small performance regression in Rainbow Six Siege and Star Wars Squadrons. It's also worth noting that the gaming benchmarks were conducted at 1080p with a GeForce RTX 3090, and this is done as we're measuring CPU performance. But under more realistic gaming conditions, so 1440p or greater when using a $1,500 GPU, the 7% margin the 5600X enjoys over the 11600K will be cut down significantly, and in most instances entirely eliminated. So while the 5600X is clearly the better gaming CPU, it's not exactly worth paying a steep premium for, as was the case with the 9th and 10th Gen Core series over AMD's Zen 2 range. Speaking of which, at the time of making this video, which is just a day before you'll actually be able to watch it, the cheapest 5600X over on Newegg is $350 US, sold by a third-party seller, as Newegg is out of stock. Then over on Amazon, the cheapest price is $400 US, so that's $100 US over the MSRP and $50 at Newegg. Here in Australia, the 5600X is selling for $550 Australian over at PC Case Gear, and that's the typical asking price in this region. They also have an OEM version for $530 without the Wraith Stealth cooler. The 11600K, on the other hand, well, that's retailing for $420, which is 24% less than that of the 5600X. Meanwhile, in the US, the 11600K is listed over at Newegg.com for $270 US, also 23% cheaper than the 5600X. So in short, the 5600X costs about 30% more in both regions, and frankly, it's not worth that price premium, especially given it should only cost about 10% more. However, if both CPUs were available at the MSRP, I think the 5600X would be the obvious choice. It's faster, much more efficient, and is fully supported on a wide range of motherboards. But at today's prices, I'd get the 11600K. Actually, no, I wouldn't do that. What I would do is forget both the 5600X and 11600K and just get the outgoing 10600K, or even better, the 10600KF. Here in Australia, the 10600K is $340 and the KF model is just $300. Then in the US, the 10600K is $230 with the KF at just $200. When compared to the 10600KF, you're looking at having to spend 35% more for the 11600K, 40% more in Australia, and as we've just seen, it's simply not worth it, especially if your focus is on gaming. So if you're in need of a CPU upgrade today and you have a budget of between $200 to $300 US, I'd recommend picking up the Core i5-10600KF. It is a cracking good CPU for the money. So yeah, that's my recommendation for the 11600K review. Still buy Intel, but just not this new one, rather the one they released this time last year. If you're after a good value motherboard to go with it, check out our top 5 best Z490 video. The MSI Z490A Pro was a good option and can still be had for $170 US today. There's also a few sub $200 US Z590 motherboards that might be better, though I suspect a Z490 board is still a better pairing with the 10th gen processor. Anyway, without testing them yet, I'm hesitant to make any recommendations, though you can expect some Z590 motherboard VRAM thermal testing over the next few weeks. Anyway, that is going to do it for this review of the Core i5-11600K. If you like the video, you know what to do. You can subscribe for more content. We will have a Core i9-11900K review on the channel soon, and I'll probably buy some other Intel CPUs that we can check out. That's all thanks to our Hardware Unboxed community members, Floatplane, Patreon. If you're interested in either of those, links are in the video description. We'll get you access to our exclusive Discord chat. We do behind-the-scenes content, Q&As, monthly live streams with Tim and myself. Really cool place. So if you're interested in tech, all this sort of stuff, then maybe check us out on Floatplane or Patreon. But if not, perfectly fine. And I would like to just thank you for watching this review. I'm your host, Steve, and I'll see you again next time.